The Democratic People's Republic of Korea and South Korea resume communications in a push for an inter-Korea summit. Will that lead to a resumption of diplomatic talks and possibly a peace agreement? Hello, I'm Anand Naidoo, and this is The Heat. This week, the DPRK, or North Korea, restored hotlines with South Korea. Pyongyang cut them in August after South Korea held a joint military exercise with the United States. The restoration marked the first time in nearly 2 months that officials from both sides made contact. But will this lead to improved diplomacy, given both countries testing new weapons in what appears to be a renewed arms race? We begin with this report from Barton in Seoul.
The restoration of the various military and civilian hotlines between Seoul and Pyongyang comes amid renewed momentum towards diplomacy on the peninsula. South Korea's President Moon Jae-in has suggested the truce agreement signed in 1953 should be replaced with a peace deal, officially ending the Korean War, still technically ongoing. Moon added an inter-Korean summit sometime soon would also be a good idea. Kim Jong-un's sister, Kim Yo-jong, responded positively to Moon's proposals, calling them an admirable idea, though she warned South Korea would have to drop its alleged double standards. Widely interpreted to mean Seoul should stop criticizing Pyongyang's ballistic missile tests, banned by the United Nations, while carrying out its own. South Korea recently tested its own submarine-launch ballistic missile, becoming the 7th country in the world with such a capability. It also launched its 3rd ballistic missile-carrying submarine. All additions to South Korea's new defensive, yet somewhat ominously named, Kill Chain Preemptive Strike System, which includes the Korea Massive Punishment and Retaliation Plan. On the other side of the DMZ, Pyongyang has been carrying out tests this year on cruise and hypersonic missiles, which are more agile and harder to shoot down than conventional ballistic missiles, which have also been tested from a train, along with a new air defense system. The UN says the DPRK has also restarted its main uranium enrichment facility, capable of creating weapons-grade nuclear material. Despite all this, South Korea's president is keen for a diplomatic breakthrough before he leaves office next year, and even Kim Jong-un has spoken publicly about food shortages and issues that clearly need sanctions relief to be eased. Diplomacy has been on hold since a summit between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un in 2019 ended without a deal. US President Joe Biden has said his administration is ready to meet with DPRK officials anywhere, anytime, though the US strategy still appears vague, if there is a strategy at all, which is why the expectation is, if real diplomacy, real dialogue begins anytime soon, it is likely to be, at least in the initial phase, a Korean affair. Barton, CGTN, Seoul.
To discuss relations between the two Koreas, let's meet our panel here in Washington, D.C. Jenny Town is a senior fellow at the Stimson Center. Also here in D.C., Brian Becker is the executive director of the Answer Coalition. Across the river in Virginia, John Sitilides is a geopolitical strategist at Trilogy Advisors, and Victor Gao is a chair professor at Soochow University, joining us from Beijing. Welcome to all of you to the show. And Jenny Town, let me start with you. So as we just heard, the DPRK and South Korea have resumed this communications hotline between the two countries. How significant is this, and why now?
Well, I don't think it's as significant as it was, say, a couple of months ago, considering that they had restored it at one point and then a couple weeks later disconnected it again because South Korea went ahead with the US-ROK joint military exercises. It is curious why they're doing it now. I think there's a lot of speculation that it has to do with trying to have some voice in the South Korean political cycles as South Korea starts to go through a presidential election. And I think there's a bit of playing to Moon is obviously very eager to resume some level of inter-Korean relations before the end of his term. And so I do think there's still continuous probing as to what's actually possible and how far is Moon willing to go.
Brian Becker, I want to stay with that question of why it's taking place right now. As we heard our reporter tell us from Seoul, sanctions against the DPRK, they are hurting. The DPRK has been talking about food shortages in the country. Do you think that the leadership in the DPRK have been acting under any kind of duress at all?
I think they've suffered so much duress in so many different ways and forms during different stages and phases that I don't think the big motivation is they're in extreme duress. I think they realize that the South Korean elections are coming up. This is an opportunity, perhaps the last opportunity in the foreseeable future to make something happen. It's important for our audience to remember that 22 years almost to the day, Madeleine Albright, who was then Secretary of State during the Clinton years, the second Clinton term, was in Pyongyang, and the U.S. and the DPRK appeared to be moving towards normalization. It was only when George W. Bush came in and sabotaged that relationship, stopped the thaw from happening, that the DPRK left the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and engaged in earnest to become a nuclear power. What needs to happen here is for Washington to say it's time to end the Korean War. If the U.S. government were to say it, if Biden were to pick up a theme that Trump carried out in the two summits, I think the DPRK would be very, very open right now, and I think there is a real opportunity for real progress.
Brian, just to get back to Madeleine Albright's visit to Pyongyang during the Clinton administration, what was the goal of those talks at that time?
Well, the goal was really, it appeared to be normalization because you had the South Korean president, Kim Dae-jung, meeting with Kim Jong-il. There was the historic summit signed in mid-June, June 15th of 2000. And it appeared that the U.S. government, the Clinton administration, had given the green light to the Sunshine Policy and to the normalization of relations between the North and the South. And it really looked like there could be normalization of relations. Everyone was quite hopeful at that time. Then when Kim Dae-jung came to the White House in March of 2001, he was treated rudely by George W. Bush. And Bush made it clear that there was an axis of evil, that they weren't going to tolerate North Korea, that they were going to carry out an aggressive policy against Iraq and Iran and North Korea, and then all bets were off. But the U.S. government could go back to that era if it wants to, if it has the desire and the will, and I think there will be real reciprocation from Pyongyang.
John Sitilides, when President Trump was in office, there were talks between the DPRK and the United States, including a summit, as our reporter told us a moment ago. But nothing of substance came of those talks. Nothing much has happened with the Biden administration. Admittedly, they've only been in office for less than a year, but we have seen nothing yet. But do you get the sense that this administration has a strategy in place or a plan? And that leads to the other question. How much of a priority is this for this administration?
Well, to your first question, Anand, I think what the Biden administration is coming to learn, despite the best of intentions, is that dating back, as Brian notes, to the Clinton administration through Bush, Obama, and Trump, is that it's really North Korea that is the deciding factor here. All of these tactical steps, whether it's an olive branch, whether it's opening up the communication lines, and let me just be clear, it's better that North Korea and South Korea are talking than not talking. But these are all tactical steps towards a larger strategic objective, and that is to buy time to advance its nuclear weapons program. And my concern is that we're falling into the trap again of another quote-unquote opportunity to engage with North Korea when they have no intention of trying to achieve the same goals that we or our South Korean allies are. So I think the Biden administration is right to make it very clear we'll meet anytime, anywhere with no preconditions and waiting for the North Koreans to respond to that. I don't know that there'll be any different response anytime soon, but I do want to underscore also what I think the other panelist, Jenny, mentioned before, And much of this, I believe, is designed to try to influence the South Korean elections in the spring. Moon Jae-in definitely wants some type of a peace legacy before he leaves office in May. And I think also Kim Jong-un is very much concerned that the People Power Party may actually come into office, bolster stronger relations with the United States, improve ties with Japan. And there are some officials in the party who even talk about a possible South Korea independent nuclear capability.
So, John, when you say the DPRK is the deciding factor, what would you like to see the DPRK do before these talks can resume?
I think it's what most, first of all, what most administrations in the U.S., but most countries in Asia and most aspects of the international community have desired. And that is the denuclearization of the North Korean military, and to find a way to bring about peace, a long-standing, enduring peace between South Korea and North Korea, where no country threatens the security of the other. It's very difficult objectively to look at the South Korean military posture today and imagine that they're preparing for any type of invasion of North Korea anytime in the foreseeable future. If one looks at the North Korea military posture, it's very much poised for a potential invasion of South Korea if they can never persuade a South Korean government to decouple from the United States alliance.
Brian, just one question on that. And do you think the DPRK will give up its nuclear arsenal, given that the United States has a history of regime change, especially in countries that do not have nuclear weapons?
No, they won't. And our other panelist there has it all wrong. I mean, the DPRK was in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and talking to the Clinton administration and meeting with Madeleine Albright and prepared to make a normalization of relations, which is what the DPRK wants. The DPRK wants good, that is, normal relations with the United States rather than being in a state of perpetual war. North Korea has no ambitions to invade South Korea. That's complete and utter nonsense. But what they are willing to do with it now that they're a nuclear power is to have, and if you look at their language, they're talking now about balance, meaning a de facto parity that would allow them to assume the position that they have enough defense that they can enter into a new domestic policy in terms of their economic orientation, and also a more comfortable, confident position in relationship either to its neighbors or to the United States. I think the DPRK, if you look at their communiques, they're not going to give up nuclear weapons, but they're ready to have some sort of arms control agreement on the South Korean peninsula. I mean, on the Korean peninsula.
John, go ahead.
I didn't have a prepared response for that, but let me just say one thing, if I might, Anand. I think the North Korean Communist Party is exceptionally skilled and experienced in exploiting and manipulating Western sentiments that somehow there is a regime in power over the last several decades that wants any genuine peace before it's recognized as a nuclear weapon state. And this is something that is not going to happen under current international community standards and objectives. It's why the sanctions have been so difficult for North Korea. And it really is up to them to begin to move back from this nuclear weapons program that is so destabilized East Asia, that threatens South Korea, that threatens Japan, and that threatens potential conventional conflict as well in Northwest Pacific region. So the ball is really in North Korea's court, and we need to be very careful to not be seduced by these wonderful wisps of a possible peace offering. I'm just very skeptical.
All right, let me go to Beijing, to Victor Gao. Victor Gao, of course, China is looking at all this very closely. It has a vested interest on stability on the Korean peninsula. There was an opinion piece, Victor, in the Washington Post a few days ago, in which the Georgetown University professor, Victor Shaw, he says, quote, and I'm quoting here, "China is conditioning cooperation on North Korea with U.S. concessions in bilateral relations." So there's a bit of linkage here as far as China is concerned. Where do you see China going with this, Victor?
Well, first of all, I tend to disagree with the conclusion from Victor Cha you just now mentioned. I think that China's position with regard to the Korean Peninsula situation is very consistent. China is opposed to any nuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, either by the North or by the South, and China works vehemently with the United Nations and other stakeholders to push for the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Now, separately, China does object to a lot of tactics or strategies by the United States in terms of alienating relations between China and the United States. But we want to view the Korean situation separately and independently. Now, another quick point is that China welcomes the recent positive developments on the Korean Peninsula, and we will urge all the parties relevant to that situation to do more to achieve greater stability and pave the way for more negotiation and diplomacy, leading eventually to two things. One is the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula on the one hand, and the other thing is to achieve peace and stability on the other hand.
Jenny Town, the South Korean foreign minister recently said that it is time, the time is ripe, he said, for a consideration of sanctions relief. Do you think there could be sanctions relief, an easing of some of the sanctions? And how do you think the DPRK will respond to that?
I don't think that's at all possible in the current political environment with North Korea actively testing new missile systems. Certainly, though, there are exemptions already built into all of the sanctions for humanitarian assistance. And certainly, you know, as many measures should be taken to clear that pathway in order for humanitarian organizations to be able to provide food assistance, medical assistance at a time when, you know, global public health really matters. But in the current political environment, no, you know, with North Korea actively testing, I think it's very hard to sell the idea of even the end of war declaration. Even the North Koreans kind of see this as not the right time. If we were going to do that, it should have been, you know, back in 2018 at the beginning of a promising you know, diplomatic process. Now we're back into a really threat-based scenario, messaging going back and forth, and, you know, active testing and active arms race going on in the region, not just on the Korean Peninsula. So the idea that North Korea is going to take steps unilaterally to give up capabilities when the rest of the region is ramping up is really a hard sell. So I think, you know, there is room for diplomacy, but I think it does require much more specifics of, you know, there's no trust on any side. So any initial steps are going to have to be very specific about outcomes are possible in the short term. This is what they are. This is what we need to negotiate first, with the expectation of once we get into negotiations, bigger things can be addressed. But short of that, this idea of just putting out a call for, you know, negotiations anytime, anywhere is just not a very compelling message.
John Sitilides, you know, in that piece in the Washington Post that I referenced a moment ago, Victor Jha also says that one option to restart diplomacy would be some form of humanitarian assistance to address what he says is North Korea's declining domestic situation. Is there any kind of appetite, do you think, in the United States for an easing of sanctions in some way to get these talks restarted?
The only thing I could conceivably consider is if there is a desperate humanitarian famine of catastrophic proportions and the degree to which the United States would be able to assist in a very targeted fashion so as to avoid any type of support or relief for the North Korean Communist Party elite or the military, and that it would only go for starving to death civilians. Otherwise, I don't see anything happening, because we know in the past, when there has been that relief, the North Korean regime has taken all of those foodstuffs for their own well-being, leaving their people to starve because they haven't cared about their population. I want to go back to another point that you raised before, Anand. I didn't answer your question about whether this was a priority for the Biden administration. Right. And I hope it is, because it needs to be taking place in the context of, as Jenny just noted, of the arms races that are developing in Asia over the last 5 to 10 years. And much of this now is leading to this new AUKUS agreement between the United States, the UK, and Australia. You have the Quad now that is more formally arranged between the US, Japan, India, and Australia. And now with the election of Fumio Kishida in Japan, who's taking a much more muscular approach to Japan's self-defense, openly speaking about working more closely with the United States, possibly intervening in the event of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. I think North Korea is watching everything that's happening beyond just the peninsula as well, and putting it into a larger geopolitical framework that we really need to emphasize in the White House as well.
Brian Becker, I'm wondering if you could clarify something for us here. When the goal is the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, that means North Korea, the DPRK, getting rid of its nuclear weapons. South Korea, as far as we know, does not have any nuclear weapons, but it is a treaty ally with the United States, and the United States, we know, has naval vessels that do have nuclear weapons that dock in South Korea. Would that mean that that can't happen anymore?
Right, of course. If it was a complete denuclearization, then the United States, which, by the way, was the entity that introduced nuclear weapons into the Korean Peninsula initially, but even now, if they're not on the ground in South Korea, they're all offshore. And let's go back to what actually happened with the Hanoi summit and before that with the Singapore summit. There was lots of threats going on. Remember, Trump said fire and fury, and he was prepared to annihilate North Korea. As soon as diplomacy started, both sides were able to quickly readjust, reorient, come to the Singapore summit. And if you look at the Singapore summit declaration, point number one is not about denuclearization. Point number one is about establishing a new relationship between DPRK and the United States, meaning a friendly relationship, a normal relationship. Second point was to create a peace regime on the Korean Peninsula to avoid the danger of war. And then number three is the process of beginning to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula. What the DPRK wants and what it won't, it will never give up its nuclear weapons. I don't believe probably ever. But what it needs first and foremost is the judgment by the United States, the sign from the United States, the sign from the Biden White House, that they are prepared to end the Korean War and resume and begin normal relations, sign a peace treaty, make a general peace declaration. The form doesn't matter that much. It's what the U.S. actually signals North Korea. Is the United States ready for a new day? If they are, North Korea will reciprocate.
Victor Gao, I know you wanted to respond to something that John said earlier on. Just go ahead.
Well, first of all, I think the whole situation on the Korean Peninsula actually depends on how all these different objectives need to be sequenced. I think we need to really line up the logical relations between the chicken and egg relations. And we cannot really allow a situation where, for example, the nuclearization situation continues while other things take place, because otherwise it will be more likely that the goal of denuclearization will never be achieved. But to achieve denuclearization, you really need to have greater wisdom, because I truly believe that simply between DPRK and the United States, there will never be real denuclearization. I think it will involve multi-parties, probably all the way to the extent of the 6 parties involved. And on the one hand, DPRK will really have assurance that there will be no regime change, there will be no surprise attack on DPRK, and then they will feel more comfortable and confident in giving up the nuclear weapons. And as to how they will give it up, again, I would say there will be a lot of wisdom to be involved. I published an article about how to achieve this. It's in public domain, and if time permits on another occasion, I can go into greater detail as to how the real denuclearization and peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula can be achieved.
Jenny, I want to get back to something you were talking about earlier on, and that is connected to these latest developments, the election that will be taking place in South Korea next year. And as you pointed out, President Moon Jae-in may want to get something accomplished before he leaves office, which is in May next year. That's a pretty narrow window. That's just a few months away from now. I mean, what is the best case scenario for him? What would he like to achieve?
Well, I think it's clear he would like to have another summit. He would like to have some progress that is potentially sustainable through a political transition, regardless of who gets elected. Certainly, any kind of improvement on the inter-Korean ties in the coming months will help his party, because he spent so much time, Moon spent so much time and energy on the North Korea issue and on inter-Korean relations as part of his legacy, that there isn't a really good domestic agenda for the party to point to as to what they brought to the Korean people. And I think there obviously had successes on the COVID containment front. There was some faltering on the vaccine side of stuff. But on the domestic agenda, in terms of chaebol reform, in terms of anti-corruption, in terms of housing prices, none of these things improved under a liberal administration. And so those are things that his party definitely has to deal with, as they also, are looking, as Moon is continuing to push on the inter-Korean side of stuff. So, whatever progress he can make may help salvage some of that domestic agenda for his party. But if he pushes too hard and raises expectations again, only to falter again before the elections, it could also hurt his party worse.
Brian, I'm going to get back to the point about the South Korean complaints that North Korea has been testing ballistic missiles. The DPRK says this is a double standard, that while South Korea wants the North to stop its tests, South Korea continues with its tests and continues to engage in military exercises with the United States. And of course, we have to add to that South Korea now has the ability to launch ballistic missiles from submarines. Given all that, does the North have a point then?
Well, I believe it does. I mean, you can't think of the South Korean military as simply the South Korean military. South Korea has the United States 100% behind it in the event of a conflict. DPRK cannot really say that. The DPRK has good relations with China. The DPRK has good relations with Russia. But there's not the same kind of relationship that North Korea enjoys with a major power that the South Korean government enjoys with the American military. The U.S. military will this year spend $750 billion, and the Korean military budget is the size of the New York City Police Department budget, about $4.5 billion. So when you think about the relative military strength between the two sides of South Korea and the United States together against the DPRK, you can't but come to the conclusion that the DPRK is on its heels and it's developing nuclear weapons as a deterrence. As I mentioned earlier, they're now also talking about balance, meaning that they are assuming or projecting a certain confidence that they have a limited kind of de facto military parity. But again, I think the North Koreans have a very good point about that.
Yeah. Okay, and we have to leave it there. We've run out of time. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. But the conversation continues online. Join us on CGTN America's Facebook page to comment on this or any other show, or chat with us on Twitter at CGTN America. I'm Anand Naidoo in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.